Fixed herself up and decided to go look for another husband. She was 32 years old, but still very, very attractive. Napoleon wasn't Napoleon, but he was an up-and-coming officer.
At that point.
Maybe. He was 6 years younger than she and several inches shorter, but they were attracted to each other and fell madly in love. They were married in a civil ceremony on March 9th, 1797.
Which happens to be my birthday.
Ah.
So that was the first one I looked for.
People tend to use my book to check their own stories, their own wedding days, birthdays, or other special days in their lives. Anyway, after the wedding, after the civil ceremony, they walked back to Josephine's apartment. She'd gotten rid of the kids for the night, but she still had her little lapdog, Fortuné, who was at home. And every time Napoleon climbed into bed with Josephine, the dog attacked him.
That's funny.
He kept kicking at it. The dog kept grabbing for his legs and kept sinking his teeth into Napoleon's legs. And Napoleon said to Josephine, you know, get the dog out of the bedroom, basically he said that. And she said, this dog's been sleeping with me a long time. I'm sorry, you'll have to get used to it. And 3 days later, he left for a military campaign in Italy, and there are reports of him pulling up his pants legs and showing the
souvenirs of his wedding
teeth marks. Right. Fortuné was around for many years. Whenever Josephine visited Napoleon, when he was traveling in battles, she would bring Fortuné with him, and they sort of got used to each other after a while.
Did you ever find out? Oh, they did get used to each other.
Sort of.
Right.
But I stood there in this bookstore, and after reading this story, I said, I can't believe this. This is hysterical. This is Napoleon, you know, and this is a lapdog. So,
Susan, did you have any idea the amount of work it was going to be to do this when you started?
No. After I read about Napoleon and Josephine, I started thinking about other famous couples throughout history. What happened when George Washington married Martha? How did Ozzie and Harriet meet? Who married Grandma Moses? Betsy Ross? I just started brainstorming, thinking about everyone I could possibly think about. I still didn't know that this was going to be a book. I didn't know that I was going to amass these dates. But it didn't take long. Within a few months, I started to see that I could fill in a calendar.
What I find fascinating is it's each day of the year. It's 365 plus one.
I had to put an Adam and Eve.
Well, that's the 366th day, or the 29th of February, as you said. And in going through the book, the range is so wide. It seemed to me that you must have had to do a great deal of editing, a great deal of choosing. It's a very well-balanced book as far as centuries, as far as multi-ethnic backgrounds,
different
young,
cultures,
old cultures.
First marriage, second marriage, sometimes it's a third marriage.
Right. It's just
where the best things happened.
You know, just fascinating. And, you know, great fun things. There are some that are absolutely wonderful. I'll just very briefly tell you something very cute. I went to a Lyrics and Lyricists concert last week, and it was the music of Irving Berlin. And what they did was they were talking about Irving Berlin and the year that her parents sent her to Europe, and the songs that were written during that time, like What'll I Do, and You Forgot to Remember, and I'm So Lonely and Blue. But you've got something else that you tell about. Tell the story of this very interesting couple.
Irving was confident about marrying
Ellen Mackay.
Ellen Mackey.
Right.
Was her name. And her father had no use for the man he called a Tin Pan Alley Jewish songwriter. And he threatened to disinherit her, cut her out of his will if she married Irving. But that didn't stop Ellen, and it really does stop young couples who are dead sure that they're going to get married. They married in 1926, and Irving gave her the copyright to his song Always as his wedding gift. That song, the royalties from that song earned her money for many years to come. And a few years later, her father lost all his money in the Great Depression, and eventually, afterwards, Irving helped his father-in-law out with money.
Yeah, it's amazing because that song is absolutely so simple and so beautiful, yet
I'll be loving you always.
Right.
That was it. And it was a love match all the way through.
Talking about love matches, some of these marriages were not love matches, but they became very good partnerships. One that is familiar to us, but not, not, it always takes retelling, is the story of Franklin Roosevelt talking about presidents, and about Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. You have, what month they were?
Well, they were married on St. Patrick's Day, not
Right.
because they chose to be married on St. Patrick's Day. It was not a good time for them personally. He was in law school. He was a second-year student at Columbia Law School. Her father had died, and her Uncle Teddy was at that time President of the United States. This is 1905, and she wanted Uncle Teddy to give her away. He offered her the White House. He said, "Do you want to have your wedding in the White House?" Eleanor said no. She wanted to be married in an aunt's townhouse in Manhattan. So Teddy said, "Well, if you want me to escort you down the aisle, you're going to have to do this on March 17th because I'll be in New York for the St. Patrick's Day parade." And that's how the day was determined.
How did they meet?
They met,
I'm gonna
I don't remember exactly how they met. They grew up together. They were family relations. They were distant cousins, and they had known each other a long time. But you have to remember that when this picture was taken, this was on their honeymoon, and Franklin, as you can see, was still in the pink of health and wonderfully well. When he did become ill with polio, it was his mother's wish that he retire from public life and become a country gentleman, live up in Hyde Park and withdraw from the world. And I admire Eleanor to no ends for the fact that she said, no, he wants to stay in politics, he wants to have a career, and I'm going to stand behind him.
What you pointed out, and I don't know whether everybody noticed while I was holding up the photo, something very unusual, and that is that Eleanor, who was a smoker, even at that young age, was holding a cigarette in her hand.
Yes.
And,
1905, that was pretty racy. Yeah.
June 12th.
June 12th is the date of the wedding of a couple that most people don't know about anymore. Her name was Bertha Kinsky, and he was Arthur von Suttner, and she became the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, also in 1905. Bertha had grown up in an Austrian family. They had had wealth until her father died. Her father had been an Austrian field marshal, and her mother subsequently squandered the family wealth at gaming tables throughout Europe, which was terrible for Bertha because she was left with very little money and very little opportunity to marry, not having a dowry. She had gotten engaged at one point, and her suitor was drowned at sea.
Oh, dear.
So by the age of 30, she decided she would become a governess. She was a spinster. She would be a governess. And she found work in Vienna for the von Suttner family, being a governess to their daughters. But she became involved with Arthur, who was 23. And as soon as the parents got wind of it, they dismissed her.
This was the oldest son in the family?
I'm not sure. He was called the Sunshine Boy. I think he was the only son in the family. Bertha then looked for another job. She went to Paris, and she got a job with Alfred Nobel, who had already invented dynamite and was a millionaire, and she became his secretary. He was very attracted to Bertha, too, but he knew that her heart was only for Arthur. But during the time they spent together, Bertha and Mr. Nobel talked about the growing climate of militarism in late 19th century Europe and their worries about the prospects of an impending war, which of course did happen in 1914. And it was Bertha who gave him the idea to have these peace prizes, to start this process of awarding Nobel Peace Prizes after his death. This did not make his potential inheritors happy because they didn't inherit his great wealth. It went instead to the prizes. Anyway, after a while, she could not be parted from Arthur anymore. She sold her last piece of good jewelry and took a train from Paris back to Vienna, ran off with Arthur, and they married. They spent the rest of their lives working for pacifist organizations. She wrote a bestseller called Lay Down Your Arms, and eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize. That's a wonderful couple, wonderful story.
It's almost like out of Jane Eyre with the years that people had to become a governess in order to survive and live.
It was also a relatively distinguished occupation for a spinster.
This must have been a rather long courtship then, or
no, but it was there were years when they were apart, and then they got back together. Yeah.
There is one section things that you sent me where you talked about long relationships. And one I found very interesting was the great love story from India.
This is the woman who inspired the construction of the Taj Mahal.
Right.
They had to wait 5 years to get married because, well, he was the son, he was a prince, son of a Shah of India, and he fell in love with a young woman named Arjumand Begum Binu Begum. I'm tripping over her name. Anyway, she didn't keep that name for long because once they married, his father renamed her Mumtaz Mahal, which meant chosen one of the palace. She was beloved by all. They married March 27th, 1612, because the court astrologers had determined that that would be an auspicious day for the wedding. This meant that the young couple had to wait 5 years. They could not see each other or speak to each other during that time until they were married.
But it was a great love.
It was a great love, and many years later, when she did die, he was heartsick, and he arranged for construction of the Taj Mahal, which is in memory of Mumtaz.
Which I understand is one of the most beautiful structures in the world. I keep seeing in my mind the picture of Princess Di sitting alone in front of the Taj Mahal, which was one that was run a great deal. John Constable, October 2nd.
Oh, now there's a timeless story. Here you've got this 19th century English landscape painter. Many people know him for Salisbury Cathedral and, of course, the Constable Flour Mills. He loved to paint English landscapes. He loved Maria Bicknell from his small town in Sussex, but her grandfather was the church rector, and he controlled all the money in the family. And he did not think that John Constable was worthy of Maria. And he also threatened to cut her out of his will if she married him. And they didn't have a lot of money, and they could not afford to get married without some dowry from Maria. It took 8 years. Unfortunately, during that time, John Constable's parents died and left him with enough money to eke out a living and marry Maria, which he did, October 2nd, and this is in the early part of the 19th century. And then the little twist is several years later, her grandfather did die, and that's when they realized he wasn't very rich after all, but he had used his power to control the family. Everyone was afraid of him, her parents. No one could object to his decisions. But you tell me if that isn't a timeless tale, if that isn't going on today, unfortunately, and in centuries past. There have always been people who try to control the family by withholding the purse strings.
You know, what I find fascinating is these are people you talk about like you know them. And
I fell in love with these couples.
You know, it's fascinating to me because one of the, as a library person and as a person who's involved, I looked over your acknowledgments and thanks, and you did such research. Of course, you thanked the staff of the White Plains Public Library as well as many others, the Performing Arts Library, you know, library, all through the how did, what came, when I say what came first, the chicken or the egg? Did you find the people and then the dates, or the dates and then the people?
You can't find the dates. There's no database until now for wedding days. There's no way to look up anyone's wedding day without looking into biographical material about that person or that couple. After I got hooked on this topic, I would go to the library and I literally went through the biographies from A to Z. And I pulled out every single one and looked into the lives of these couples or these people. I also referred to journals, diaries,
was there
any
a date
material
you
I could
had
find.
particular trouble with?
No. No, but it was all at random. It was all at random. It was like filling in a jigsaw puzzle. There are some couples in the book whose dates are only approximate. These tend to be very, very old couples. In 1017, a king of England named Canute, who was a Norseman, married Emma of Normandy. She'd been married to Ethelred the Unready, who was really a brute. And after he died, she remarried King Canute. And the best I could find was July. 1017.
So you
so
gave
I
them
put
an
them in a
anniversary.
date, and I tell the reader it's approximate.
That's, you know, Charles Darwin. What was so interesting about his?
Well, first of all, this is the great believer in the theories of evolution and natural selection, and who does he marry? His first cousin.
He really did. Oh, that's but did they know then that there were problems?
I don't know. I would imagine they knew. I mean, the marriage was fine. The kids turned out fine. I would think that they knew this. This is only about 150 years ago. I think they were married in 1839. And her name was Emma Wedgwood, and she was a member of the famous Wedgwood family of potters.
Right.
Yes. Now, she was much more religious than Charles. Emma did not support his theories of evolution. It bothered her religiously, but she was a good wife. She proofread his manuscripts anyway.
And how, now, where did you find this information on them? Was this just on a biography?
He also wrote his autobiography. Many places, many places. There are many reference materials in the library that I did not know about before, but which I discovered all in the reference section. Many collections of biographies. For example, the von Suttners I found in a book about great Nobel Prize winners. There might be books on artists, of course, composers. There's a collection called Dictionary of American Biography, which is about anybody, whoever was anybody in American history going back.
But what I think is fascinating is the personal side and how you, when you read through these, and I was going to look through it last night, and I just kept, reading and pulling out, and it keeps your interest.
Well, there's a lot of gossipy facts, a lot of little tidbits.
Well, it's awfully nice to know how other people have.
You know what people wore, what they said, various things.
There are great lovers. One of the most timeless stories are Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning.
Yes.
And you include them in here. Even though we all know the story.
You can't leave it out.
You can't tell it.
You can't leave it out. Well, he wrote her a letter and he told her how much he loved her poetry. She had been pretty much a recluse in her house in Wimpole Street. Her father did not think that any of his children should marry, a controlling parent. And you know what? They always lose. They always lose in the end, the parents. Parents who think they can control who their kids marry usually lose in the end. The parents who support their kids, who stand behind their decisions, generally have a lifelong relationship with their kids. But her father was not that way. He opposed her marrying anyone. It wasn't Robert Browning. It was just the idea of her leaving home. So she corresponded with Robert Browning, and then she would slip out of the house and see him occasionally. At last they married in a church nearby. She had slipped out of the house with a maidservant, gone to a church and married Robert. The rings were put on, and then they were taken off. The bride and groom left through separate doors. She went back to Wimpole Street. He went back to his house, and they had to wait. She said, I have to write my father a letter before I can leave. And it took a week. And during that week, Robert refused to come visit her. He had been calling at the house, but he said, how can I go and ask for Miss Barrett when your name is Mrs. Browning now? And he wouldn't go to the house. But they corresponded through letters back and forth.
Handsome young man, and she was a lady of certain years. She was
older than he.
Right.
So a week later, they met at a train station. She wrote her father a letter of goodbye. She met Robert at a train station in England, and they went by ferry across the English Channel, and they went to Florence, and they lived there for many years.
Very happily. She had a child by
yes,
then,
she
as
did.
I remember.
Yes.
In the warmth of the climate.
Yes,
the stories
Florence.
are wonderful.
Their house is still in Florence. You can go visit it. It's right near the Pitti Palace.
In December, you have one particularly interesting one on December 15th.
There are a lot of ones, but one of them, December 15th, is the wedding day of Frederick Bartholdi and his wife Jean Emily. You would know him because he is the man who designed the Statue of Liberty for France. His mother, again, was opposed to him getting married. She didn't think he needed to get married at all. And he had met Jean Emily, who had been a dressmaker. He was looking for a model to pose for the Statue of Liberty. And I guess he thought that she had graceful limbs and could stand like this for a long time. It's been said by many who've studied the features of the Statue of Liberty that the face,
which is rather stern,
austere, is Maman.
Okay.
But the body of the Statue of Liberty is Jean Emily. And she was by his side in 1876 when the fireworks were all over the East River and down in the harbor. And France gave this beautiful gift to the United States.
You know, you also have divvied this your travels among all these wonderful couples, and I really feel I know them, as to things that went on. For example, some people had the jitters. You mentioned Jules Verne.
Jules Verne. Now,
all the people who would be a time traveler.
Right, time traveling. He could go to think about traveling under the sea, voyages to outer space, but the thought of getting married had him absolutely petrified. He didn't remember what happened later. He said, I handed out money to everyone. I didn't know who I was talking to. This is Jules Verne.
And his wife?
She was okay. She was calm about it. Eleanor Roosevelt was jittery. She wasn't jittery about marrying Franklin, but remember, this was the St. Patrick's Day parade that was going on right outside her aunt's townhouse windows.
Right.
So we had bagpipes going. We had crowds of people. Uncle Teddy was late to the wedding because he had to push through these mobs who were really so interested in seeing him more interested than the fact that there was a wedding going on.
Man.
Yes, yes. His daughter Alice Lee said that to her it was her father, Teddy liked to be the corpse at every funeral and the bride at every wedding. He loved attention.
Thomas Alva Edison is another one you said
Another
was
one
a
who was
nervous
very
person.
He didn't think he would make it. He wasn't. She wrote it to Minna. I don't know if I'll get through the day. And her parents were a little wary of him when he came courting. He had been a widower. He was a little older than Minna, and they didn't want to leave him alone with their young daughter. So they were always chaperoned. They were always meeting in a family setting. Consequently, he taught her Morse code. And that's how he proposed to Minna. He proposed by tapping, will you marry me, into her palm, and she tapped her answer, yes, into his palm, and they did this in front of other people who didn't even know it.
I'm just looking. This one, I think, is particularly fascinating, and does everybody know who this is? I didn't.
He's a very handsome young man.
It certainly
Sigmund
is.
Freud.
It's Sigmund Freud, who obviously was not repressed. Tell me about his relationship.
He wrote her 900 love letters over the course of their 4.5-year courtship. It took that long for them to get married because he was a struggling young doctor and he was not earning enough to support a wife. Her parents were a little nervous about the extent of this long-term relationship, and they moved with her to a nearby town.
Right.
But that's why he wrote all those love letters.
And he was very poetic.
He was very poetic, very romantic. He gave her a garnet ring as an engagement ring.
And you had said, what was that he quoted?
One is very crazy when one is in love.
It's fascinating.
Who else? But
it's
Freud
true.
Would say that. Yeah.
Have you plans for any more books?
Well, there certainly could be more wedding days. I keep finding new couples, reading other stories, uncovering people that we hadn't heard about before. I've always been fascinated. I've always read biographies. I've always been interested in seeing what makes a marriage work. And these are couples who entered into marriage with high hopes, and they didn't always know that they were going to become great painters or musicians or politicians at the beginning. But in that relationship, good things came out.
Susan, talking about good things coming out, this is a very good book.
Thank you.
It's well written. Your experience, this wedding days, when and how great marriages began. Your experience as a good journalist shows through here, and also there's a warmth and a humanness in it. Again, wedding days. You'll find it at the White Plains Public Library. And call and find out, when is it, February? Do you remember the date you're coming?
February 23rd.
On the evening of February 21st, Susan will be here. We're really looking forward to her visit. We're looking forward to your coming to the library to learn more about what's happening. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.